Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Holland Land Office Museum's Artifact Video Series. My name is Ryan Duffy, and I'm the director of the museum. And this week we're going to talk about probably the most well-known Civil War regiment involving soldiers from Genesee County in the county's history, and that is the 8th New York Heavy Artillery. Now, the history of the 8th New York stretches from 1862 through the end of the war. However, it didn't begin as the 8th New York Heavy Artillery. Now, the history of the regiment actually goes back to July 1862, right after the second call by President Abraham Lincoln for volunteers to join the Union Army. This time he was searching for 300,000, and it fell upon Peter Porter of Niagara Falls to raise a regiment from the 29th District. Now, Porter was a lawyer and up-and-coming politician out of Niagara Falls, and he sought to recruit soldiers to a regiment from 3 counties, Genesee, Orleans, and Niagara. And this process began very early in July of 1862, and the unit would be called the 129th New York Volunteer Infantry. Now, the headquarters for the unit would be in Lockport in Niagara County, as that was probably the most central location between the 3 counties. And Porter eventually made his way to Batavia a couple of weeks later to make his pitch to the members of Genesee County to raise up soldiers in order to fill out this regiment. And he did this at the Eagle Tavern right in Batavia. And his call for volunteers was met with roarous applause, and Genesee County supplied its fair share of men from across the townships to the 129th New York Infantry. And these men would fill out companies G, H, and I of the 129th. The regiment began to congregate in Lockport, and the men from Genesee County made it there in early August 1862. And this would be the first part of their training, where they would drill constantly and sort of become the basic version of a soldier. However, this is just where their story would begin, as within the next few months they would first transport to Elmira, New York, and then eventually make their way to Baltimore. And it is here that they would spend most of the first part of the war as a garrison force, first in Baltimore itself and then in some of the surrounding forts, particularly Fort McHenry, where they would be in charge of guarding prisoners. And part of this duty would also be to transport prisoners to other facilities farther north or farther south to be paroled. As by the end of 1862, their designation was changed from the 129th New York Volunteer Infantry to the 8th New York Heavy Artillery. Lee's move into Maryland and into Western Virginia, this put units like the 8th New York on high alert, and they eventually moved their way partially into areas like Harper's Ferry to help defend the station there. And they were in some small skirmishes up until 1864, but they had never fought in any major battle. This would change in May, as they would become part of a force that would battle at Spotsylvania Courthouse. They would be involved in a smaller engagement during that overall battle. On May 19th, the unit charged across a cornfield at a Confederate unit that was in a tree line, and this is where the unit would actually take its first battlefield casualties. However, they were successful in their charge in forcing the Confederates off the position. The 8th would suffer 33 casualties, including 11 killed. This would just be a precursor to what was to come for the 8th New York, as they would soon become involved in one of the deadliest battles of the Civil War. Now, in June 1864, Grant began to make his move towards Richmond, but this would result in the Battle of Cold Harbor, and the 8th New York would actually be involved in the first attack of the Union forces against the Confederate lines there. Early morning of June 3rd, 50,000 Union troops, including the 8th New York, would attack lines manned by 30,000 Confederates, and the attack would end up becoming a disaster, particularly for the 8th New York, as their regiment would suffer the highest casualties out of any involved in the attack. And it was not just the amount of casualties that the unit suffered that was devastating, but it was who the casualties were, as Colonel Porter, the commanding officer, would be killed at this battle as they made their charge against the Confederate breastwork. The unit would suffer 80 killed, over 300 wounded, and nearly 100 missing, for over 500 casualties out of a force of about 1,800. This was staggering losses. Battle of Cold Harbor would also represent one of the most inspiring actions of the 8th's history, and that was the retrieval of Colonel Porter's body from the battlefield. Now, Porter's body was left where he fell, as his unit had to retreat, but in the coming days, efforts were made to try to retrieve the commanding officer's body. However, one volunteer stepped forward, Sergeant Leroy Williams, who enlisted in Genesee County but was originally from Oswego, and he volunteered to go track down the colonel's body and bring it eventually back to the lines. So he made a reconnaissance mission to find the body, came back, grabbed a few other volunteers, and was actually able to bring back the colonel's body to the line so it could be buried with his comrades. And this action actually earned Leroy Williams the Medal of Honor. Command of the regiment would then fall to Colonel Willard Bates out of Medina, he was the commanding officer for their next major engagement in the battles around Petersburg later in 1864. The 8th would be involved in heavy fighting around Petersburg, and Colonel Bates would demonstrate his ability to command as he held the troops together in face of ferocious attacks and counterattacks by the Confederate forces. And it was in this fighting that the unit suffered over 150 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The fighting for the 8th Heavy Artillery was particularly fierce around Petersburg on the Weldon Road, which connected Petersburg into North Carolina and was a vital supply route for the Confederacy. And it was here that actually Colonel Bates would be killed, and the unit would lose its commander for the second time within a few months. And besides Colonel Bates, they would lose almost another 100 men in casualties. Command of the unit would then fall to James Willett, who was the former district attorney of Genesee County. The next major action that the 8th Heavy Artillery would face would be at Rheem Station in late August 1864, and this is where the unit would actually face its most disappointing effort, as they fought very bravely in an engaged effort against the Confederate forces there, but were eventually surrounded and forced to retreat and actually lost their unit colors during the battle, which was seen as the highest level of the loss of honor and put the unit in poor standing amongst the commanding officers of the Army. And during this battle, they suffered another 200 casualties. After this battle, General Order number 63 was issued against the 8th New York Heavy Artillery. Since they had lost their colors during the battle, they were no longer allowed to march with colors, and thus for quite a few months actually fought without their regimental colors. In October, though, the unit would be able to regain their honor as they fought bravely and well at the Battle of Boynton Plank Road and were able to defeat the Confederate forces there, and thus with their action they were able to regain their regimental colors and regain their standing in the Army. The unit would serve in the Army of the Potomac through the end of the war and actually would be in the vicinity of Appomattox Courthouse with the ending of the war, and then would be disbanded in June of 1865. The unit suffered well over 650 casualties throughout their time in the conflict, and out of the 1,800 original members, only a little over 300 were left by the end of the war. Now, several members, many men from Genesee County served in this unit, but we'd like to highlight at least one because we have a very important piece from them, and that is Captain Elbridge T. Sherwin, as we actually have his officer's sword here on display. So here we have the officer's sword of Captain Elbridge T. Sherwin, and he served in the 8th New York in Company G. Now, Sherwin was born in 1836 and lived in Batavia for most of his life, and he actually enrolled in what was the 129th New York Infantry on August 13th, 1862 in Lockport, and then transferred with the regiment to the 8th New York Heavy Artillery Regiment. For much of his career, he served with the regiment at Fort McHenry from December 1862 to May 1864, and he also participated at the battles of Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg, where the unit saw heavy action. Now, at the Battle of Jerusalem Plank Road, where Colonel Bates was killed, many of the officers of Company G were also killed, and Captain Sherwin actually took over command of the company and resumed the attack while it was going on against the Confederate forces. And one member of Company G said, "I never saw men so cool under fire," when referring to Sherwin's leadership and composure during the battle. Sadly, Sherwin would not be able to survive the war, as he actually died from fever at the end of July in 1864 in an Army hospital. But his body was brought back home, and he is buried in the historic Batavia Cemetery on Harvester Avenue. And this officer's sword that we have on display here was actually gifted to him by the business leaders and merchants of Batavia. And you won't be able to tell from here, but there's actually an inscription on the hilt that gives Now this sword was actually gifted to the museum in 1961 by his grandnephew, who was a Navy captain, Sidney Sherwin, and was a local businessman here. So this sword went through several generations before it ended up at the museum here. Now I'd just like to give a quick thank you to Don Burkle for finding out the information about this sword, and Captain Sherwin to give us a better background on it. Now I hope you enjoyed this edition of our Artifact video series, and I hope you check us out as we do more in the future. And in case you've missed any, please check out our YouTube channel, Holland Land Office Museum, and you can watch as many in a row as you like. And if you've enjoyed the topic of this video, be sure to stop by the museum and you can check out these artifacts in person and learn more about the 8th New York Heavy Artillery Regiment.